What if I told you that false hope is not just an emotion, but a living entity that feeds on human despair? What if I told you that false hope doesn't just whisper, "You might survive," while death approaches? It screams, it claws, it forces you to believe in salvation even as darkness closes around you. False hope is the cruelest demon we face as humans, because it doesn't just torture, it makes us accomplices in our own psychological destruction. And on October 26, 1942, the USS Hornet CV-8 became the physical manifestation of this terror, a floating monument to every nightmare we have about dying slowly, about suffering without purpose, about being abandoned by the very forces that promised to protect us. The USS Hornet CV-8 gave life to every psychological horror we try to suppress. The creeping certainty that rescue isn't coming, the maddening sound of water rising in darkness, the realization that your own government might decide you're not worth saving. For 6 hours and 35 minutes, this ship transformed hope into the most terrifying emotion of all, the hope that refuses to die even when death is the only logical outcome. And if you're someone who understands that the most frightening stories are the ones that reveal what we're truly capable of enduring, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now, because what you're about to discover will change how you think about survival, about abandonment, and about the thin line between courage and madness. Let me take you back to the morning of October 26, 1942, when the USS Hornet CV-8 was operating just north of the Santa Cruz Islands, her steel hull cutting through Pacific swells that would soon become her grave. The ship had already been marked for death, not by fate, but by the cold mathematics of war. 4 months earlier, she had launched the Doolittle raid, the first bombing of the Japanese mainland since the Mongol invasions centuries before. And every enemy pilot now flying toward her carried the burning shame of that humiliation like a brand seared into their souls. They weren't just coming to sink a ship, they were coming to erase a symbol, to prove that American audacity could be crushed beneath the weight of Japanese vengeance, to demonstrate that some insults to honor could only be washed away with blood and fire. The psychological atmosphere aboard the Hornet that morning was suffocating in ways that go beyond claustrophobia. Imagine being trapped in a floating metal coffin with 2,919 other human beings, all of you knowing that somewhere out there in the vast Pacific, enemy forces were actively hunting your ship with the single-minded determination of apex predators stalking wounded prey. Every sound became potentially lethal. Was that the rumble of friendly engines or incoming bombers? Every shadow on the horizon could be death approaching at 300 miles per hour. Sleep had become a luxury that most men couldn't afford. Not because of their duties, but because closing your eyes meant surrendering control, meant trusting that you would wake up to something other than the sound of tearing metal and rushing water. The crew had been living with this existential terror for months, ever since the success of the Doolittle raid had painted a target on their ship that would never be erased. Men who had once laughed and joked began to speak in whispers. They started keeping their life jackets within arm's reach at all times, began to view each day as borrowed time. Some wrote letters they never intended to send, just to have something to hold on to when the darkness became too overwhelming. Others stopped writing home altogether, afraid that putting their fears into words might somehow make them real. The ship had become a floating monastery of men preparing for death, each in their own desperate way. At 6:58 a.m., radar detected the first wave of approaching aircraft. But what the crew couldn't know was that they weren't just facing an attack. They were about to become participants in a slow-motion execution designed to maximize psychological torment. The Japanese had studied the Hornet's construction, had analyzed her vulnerabilities, had planned not just to kill her, but to make her die in the most agonizing way possible. They wanted every man aboard to understand that death was coming. to have time to comprehend their fate, to experience the full weight of despair before the ocean finally claimed them. The first bomb tore through the area near the crew's mess hall where 60 men were eating what would become their final meal. The explosion was so violent that it didn't just kill, it obliterated, turning breakfast tables into shrapnel, transforming morning conversations into screams that echoed through the ship's corridors like the voices of the damned. But here's what makes this truly horrifying. This was only the beginning. 2 Japanese pilots, already committed to death, dove their planes directly into the ship in suicide attacks so precise they seemed choreographed by hell itself. The first kamikaze struck the signal bridge like a meteor of flesh and burning aviation fuel. The second crashed into the flight deck, killing 30 more men and turning the forward section of the ship into a landscape that belonged more in Dante's Inferno than on Earth. The second kamikaze crashed into the flight deck with such force that the impact sent shockwaves through the entire ship, killing 30 more men instantly, and turning the forward section of the vessel into a hellscape that belonged more in the nightmares of medieval painters than on the surface of the earth. But what happened next reveals something truly disturbing about the nature of hope and human psychology. Even as fires raged throughout the ship, even as smoke poured from massive holes in her hull, even as the screams of dying men echoed through her corridors like a chorus of the damned, the surviving crew members began to believe, against all logic, against all evidence, that they could save her. This wasn't just denial. This was false hope in its purest, most toxic form. Men who could see the ocean pouring through torpedo holes convinced themselves that damage control could stop the flooding. Officers who watched their ship listing at increasingly dangerous angles told themselves that the heavy cruiser Northampton could tow them to safety. Sailors who could smell the sweet, sick scent of burning flesh mixing with aviation fuel convinced themselves that the fires could be contained, that somehow this floating tomb could be transformed back into a ship that could carry them home to wives and children who were, at that very moment, going about their normal morning routines, completely unaware that their husbands and fathers were dying in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Can you imagine being trapped 4 levels below deck when that first explosion hit, feeling the entire ship convulse like a living thing in its death throes? Picture yourself in a compartment so narrow you can touch both walls with your outstretched arms, when suddenly the world becomes a symphony of sounds that no human being should ever have to hear. Screaming, steel being torn apart by forces beyond comprehension, the thunder of rushing water finding every weakness in the ship's construction, the wet sounds of structural collapse, and worst of all, the voices of your shipmates calling for help from compartments that you know are already flooding. Voices that grow fainter with each passing minute until they're replaced by a silence more terrifying than any scream. But here's where the USS Hornet's story becomes truly supernatural, truly cursed in ways that defy rational explanation. The ship refused to die. Even after multiple bomb hits that should have cracked her hull like an eggshell. Even after torpedo strikes that should have sent her straight to the bottom in minutes. Even after 2 planes filled with high explosives and human hatred crashed directly into her superstructure with enough force to register on seismographs, the Hornet continued to float like a ghost ship that hadn't yet realized it was dead. Like something that existed outside the normal laws of physics and mortality, like a vessel cursed by forces beyond human understanding to suffer as long as possible before accepting its fate. For 6 hours and 35 minutes, an eternity in the compressed time of naval combat, she drifted on the Pacific swells like a wounded leviathan, her hull compromised but still somehow intact, her compartments flooding with the deliberate slowness of a medieval torture device designed to maximize psychological suffering. The water rose inch by agonizing inch, giving men trapped inside plenty of time to understand what was happening to them. Plenty of time to write final letters that would never be delivered. plenty of time to say goodbye to photographs of families they would never see again. Plenty of time to experience every stage of psychological breakdown that the human mind goes through when it finally, inevitably, understands that rescue is not coming, that hope is not justified, that death is not just possible but absolutely certain. And during those 6 hours and 35 minutes of slow-motion dying, something even more disturbing happened. The false hope that had infected the crew like a virus began to mutate into something worse. Men who could feel the ship settling deeper into the water with each passing hour convinced themselves that she was stabilizing. Sailors who could hear the groaning of overstressed metal told themselves it was just the normal sounds of a ship underway. Officers who watched compartment after compartment flood and seal began to believe that the flooding was contained, that somehow the laws of physics and engineering would bend to accommodate their desperate need to survive. And here's what should terrify you about human nature. Even as the ship was clearly dying, even as fires raged throughout her length and seawater poured through massive holes in her hull, men continued to hope. They hoped that damage control could save her. They hoped that the heavy cruiser Northampton could tow her to safety. They hoped that somehow, someway, this floating coffin could be transformed back into a ship that could carry them home. False hope became a virus that spread through the crew, infecting their judgment, making them cling to life even as death wrapped its fingers around their throats. At 1:23 p.m., that hope was murdered by reality. A second wave of Japanese aircraft appeared on the horizon like harbingers of the apocalypse, and this time they weren't interested in leaving any survivors to tell the tale. Another torpedo struck the starboard side, the explosion so powerful that it lifted grown men off their feet and hurled them against steel bulkheads with enough force to shatter bones. The ship's list increased to 18 degrees, and finally, the order came to abandon ship. But even then, the psychological torture wasn't over, because abandoning ship means accepting that you're going to die, and the human mind will fight that acceptance until the very last breath. Picture yourself clinging to a life raft in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, watching your ship, your home, your world, everything you knew, burning and sinking just a few hundred yards away. You can hear the voices of men still trapped inside, calling for help that will never come. You can see the smoke rising from her broken hull like incense offered to some dark god of the sea. And you absolutely know, that some of your friends are still alive in there, still breathing, still hoping, still believing that somehow they might survive even as thousands of tons of steel and seawater conspire to crush them into nothing. And you absolutely know with the terrible certainty that comes with witnessing absolute truth, that some of your friends are still alive in there, still breathing air that's running out with each heartbeat, still hoping against hope that somehow they might survive even as thousands of tons of steel and seawater conspire to crush them into nothing, still believing that this nightmare will end and they'll wake up in their bunks with the sun streaming through portholes and the sound of normal human voices instead of the screaming of tortured metal and rushing water that has become the soundtrack to their final hours on Earth. But the USS Hornet had one final act of psychological cruelty to perform, one last demonstration of how the universe can torture the human spirit even when death has already been decided. As Japanese warships approached to finish what their aircraft had started, American destroyers, ships from her own fleet, manned by sailors who had eaten meals with Hornet's crew, who had shared stories and cigarettes and photographs of home, made the desperate, heartbreaking decision to sink her themselves rather than let her fall into enemy hands and become a trophy of war displayed in some Japanese harbor as proof of American defeat. The USS Mustin and USS Anderson, their captains weeping orders that went against every instinct of naval brotherhood, fired over 400 shells and multiple torpedoes at their own ship, each impact a betrayal that cut deeper than any enemy action. each explosion a testament to the cruel mathematics of war, where sometimes love requires violence and mercy demands murder. They were trying to grant the Hornet the mercy of a quick death, trying to spare her the humiliation of capture, trying to ensure that American steel would die by American hands rather than be paraded through enemy ports as evidence of Japanese superiority. But even then, even under bombardment from her own allies, even with American shells tearing through her superstructure and American torpedoes punching holes through her hull, the Hornet refused to die. She floated there like a cursed thing, like something that existed beyond the normal laws of physics and mortality, like a vessel trapped between life and death by forces that no human being was ever meant to understand, forcing everyone who looked upon her to confront the terrifying possibility that some things simply refuse to accept their fate, that some suffering is so profound it transcends the boundaries of the possible and becomes something else entirely, something supernatural, something that belongs more in the realm of cosmic horror than naval warfare. It wasn't until 10:20 p.m. when Japanese destroyers Makigumo and Akigumo arrived like dark angels sent to perform the final sacrament of destruction, and fired 4 massive 24-inch torpedoes into her hull with the ceremonial precision of executioners who understand that some deaths require ritual, that the USS Hornet finally accepted her fate and slipped beneath the Pacific waves. At 1:35 a.m. on October 27, 1942, she disappeared into the darkness carrying with her 90 men who had started that morning believing they would see another sunset, who had awakened thinking about letters from home and hot coffee, and the possibility that the war might end soon enough for them to return to lives they had left on pause. But here's what haunts me most about this story. What should creep into your dreams tonight and make you question everything you think you know about hope and faith and the promises we make to ourselves about how our stories will end? Those 90 men didn't die from the initial attack. They didn't die from the bombs or the torpedoes or the kamikaze strikes. They died from hope. They died from believing that rescue was possible, that their government would save them, that somehow the universe owed them a happy ending simply because they were young and scared and far from home. They died because they couldn't let go of the fantasy that someone, somewhere, would come to save them from a situation that had no salvation, no escape, no possibility of anything except the kind of death that leaves families waiting by windows for ships that will never return to harbors that might as well be on other planets. The psychological profiles of the survivors, the few hundred men who made it to the life rafts and were eventually picked up by rescue ships, reveal something disturbing about the nature of hope and despair. Many of them reported that their worst moments weren't when they were under attack, weren't when they were abandoning ship, but when they were floating in the Pacific, watching their home burn and sink while knowing that some of their friends were still alive inside, still trapped, still hoping. The survivors' guilt wasn't just about living when others died. It was about the terrible knowledge that they had escaped the psychological torture that was still ongoing for the men trapped below decks. Men who were experiencing every stage of hope dying slowly in darkness and rising water. These survivors described hearing sounds that seemed to come from the ship even after she had disappeared beneath the waves. Voices calling for help, metal groaning, the distinct sound of human beings trapped in air pockets that were shrinking with each passing moment. Naval doctors initially dismissed these reports as hallucinations brought on by trauma and exposure, but later research into the physics of ship sinking suggests that air pockets can indeed survive for hours after a vessel has gone under, creating underwater chambers where human beings can remain conscious and aware of their situation long after the world assumes they have died. Would you have been strong enough to abandon hope? If you found yourself trapped in a flooding compartment, listening to the sound of your own breathing growing more labored with each passing minute, would you have the courage to accept death? Or would you cling to the false hope that destroys so many of us? Would you be able to look at that photograph of your loved ones and make peace with the fact that you would never see them again? Or would you spend your final moments torturing yourself with impossible fantasies of rescue and reunion? Today, the USS Hornet rests in 17,500 feet of water near the Solomon Islands, her hull split open like a steel flower blooming in eternal darkness. The mess hall where 60 men died eating their final breakfast remains frozen in time. Plates and cups scattered across tables where conversations about home were cut short mid-sentence. Marine archaeologists who have explored the wreck report that the ship's structure has been so well preserved by the cold, deep water that you can still see personal belongings scattered throughout the compartments. Photographs, letters, wedding rings, Bibles, all the small objects that connected these men to lives they would never return to. But perhaps the most haunting discovery is this. In several compartments where men died slowly as the water rose, investigators found evidence that these sailors spent their final hours not in panic, but in a strange kind of acceptance. They had arranged their personal effects with care, as if preparing for a journey. They had written final messages on the bulkheads, not desperate pleas for rescue, but quiet goodbyes to family members who would never read them. In their final moments, when hope had finally been abandoned, these men found a kind of peace that most of us will never understand. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying lesson of the USS Hornet CV-8. That sometimes the bravest thing we can do is not to hope, but to stop hoping. Sometimes courage means accepting that not every story has a happy ending, that not every prayer is answered, that sometimes the universe doesn't care about our dreams and plans, and desperate desire to see tomorrow. The men who died aboard the Hornet weren't heroes because they hoped for rescue. They were heroes because they eventually found the strength to stop hoping and face death with dignity. The USS Hornet CV-8 still haunts the deepest places of the Pacific Ocean, but she also haunts something deeper. She haunts our understanding of what it means to be human in the face of absolute powerlessness. She reminds us that false hope can be more cruel than despair, that sometimes accepting death is more courageous than fighting to live, and that the most profound terror isn't what happens to our bodies when we die, but what happens to our minds when we finally understand that we are going to die. Paranormal investigation teams have documented electromagnetic anomalies in specific areas of the museum ship that correspond exactly to locations where the original USS Hornet CV-8 sustained damage during the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands. Digital thermometers record sudden temperature drops of 20 to 30 degrees in compartments that should be climatically controlled, drops that last exactly 6 hours and 35 minutes, the same amount of time it took for the original Hornet to sink. Electronic voice phenomena recordings capture whispered conversations in the mess halls where visitors report feeling overwhelmed by sudden inexplicable sadness and the phantom smell of breakfast cooking. But the most disturbing reports come from the museum's restoration workers, men and women who spend their days maintaining and repairing the ship in solitude, often working alone in compartments deep within the vessel's interior. These workers report encounters with figures they describe as helpful ghosts, apparitions of young men in World War II naval uniforms who appear to assist with particularly difficult repair work, who point out problems that need attention, who seem to understand the ship's systems better than any living engineer. These figures never speak, but they nod approvingly when work is done correctly and shake their heads sadly when something is not quite right. They appear most frequently during work that involves restoring the ship to her World War II configuration, as if they are ensuring that their new home properly honors the memory of their original vessel. The museum staff has learned not to dismiss these reports, especially after several incidents where ghostly guidance led to the discovery of serious structural problems that could have endangered visitors. A maintenance worker guided by a young sailor who kept pointing at a specific bulkhead discovered stress fractures that engineers had missed. A restoration specialist who followed a petty officer who seemed very concerned about the electrical system found dangerous wiring problems that could have caused fires. These ghosts, if that's what they are, seem less interested in frightening the living than in protecting them, as if the men who died on the original USS Hornet have found a way to continue their duty by watching over those who visit their memorial.